And now a little story from the apple seed.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you. My father was born in 1901. He was number 8 of 13 children. He was born on a little farm way back in the Smoky Mountains in North Carolina. Most of that land today is part of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. But see, right in the middle of those 13 children, there were 4 boys right in a row that were just 1 year apart. There was Uncle Moody, Uncle Harry, then my daddy, and Uncle Frank. And they grew up so inseparable and so right together throughout all their lives. And I used to love to hear my daddy tell me and my little brother stories about things they did when they were little. It was probably about 1910. Those boys were about, say, 9 and 10 and 11 and 12 years old when one summer they were helping their daddy, my grandfather, do what they called making hay. They had what my dad described as a beautiful team of blonde Belgian workhorses. And they would mow the hay and then hope that it could dry in the sun for a couple of days without being rained on. And then they would rake it up into little windrows and then rake those rows up into little piles. And there was a way they could throw a chain around that pile of hay, the chain hooked to the horse, and stand on it and pull it back to the barn. And then the real work started of building the big haystacks around 2 poles, like 2 big telephone poles at the end of the barn, hay, so it would shed water all through the winter and the cows could eat off those haystacks all through the winter. And at the end of one of those days of work, they would have hay everywhere. Hay up their nose, hay down inside their clothes, hay in their ears, hay in their hair. They would be itching to death all over. Well, my daddy would say, "What would you want to do at a time like that?" And my brother and I would say, "Take a bath." That's so he could say, we didn't have a bathroom. So what they would do is they would walk about a mile to the Pigeon River. And then they would take off all their clothes. Nobody was around watching anywhere. And they would shake their clothes and try to beat all the hay out of their clothes. And then they'd jump in the river and they'd swim around and they'd get some of the sand along near the edges and they'd scrub till they got all the itchy parts off. And then they'd shake their clothes some more while they were running around till they got dry, and then they'd go back home. One of those days, they finished working in the hay and they started to go to the river. When all of a sudden, Uncle Frank, that was my dad's youngest brother. And in their family, my daddy said Uncle Frank had a special job. He was in charge of bad ideas. Now, every family has one of those, don't you? Frank said, "It's too far to run a mile to the river. What we need is a swimming hole at home." His brother said, "Well, what in the world is that?" He said, "I read about it in a book. It's what rich people have. It's a big hole in the ground out behind your house that's full of water. And anytime you want to, you go out there and jump in it. Let's dig one." And my daddy said he told his brothers it sounded like it was dangerous. And Uncle Frank said, "That's why we're not going to tell anybody." I remember going to visit out at that farm when I was growing up. And right outside the kitchen door, there was a big sort of half-moon-shaped rock that came up out of the ground. And they decided to go on the other side of that rock. So if their mother, my grandmother, looked out there, she wouldn't see what they were doing. They went to the barn and they gathered up all the tools they could dig with: spade, shovel, mattock, pickaxe. And they came out behind that rock. By now, my daddy had said, "I'll watch you get in trouble, but I'm not going to help." And they marked off a big square on the ground. It was late summer, and it hadn't rained in so long, the ground was so hard, they just couldn't dig a hole in it. But then Uncle Frank got an idea. He said, let one of us take the mattock, and we'll chop and chop and chop and chop till we get some dirt loose, and then another one can take the shovel and shovel that dirt out, and then we'll chop some more and shovel some more and chop some more and shovel some more. And they figured if they kept doing that, in about 100 years, they'd have a swimming hole. So they were working away. Uncle Harry is chopping with the mattock, and Uncle Frank is shoveling with the shovel. Now, in addition to being in charge of bad ideas, my dad used to say that his brother Frank, my uncle, was born with a slight birth defect. He was born without a lid to go on his mouth. And it ran all the time. He talked all day long. He had to put food back in several times because he kept talking while he was eating. He'd stop talking just long enough to go to sleep at night, and then he'd talk in his sleep all night. And my daddy said when Uncle Frank was talking, it consumed his entire mentality. Are you getting the picture now? Uncle Harry's chopping with the mattock. Uncle Frank is shoveling with the shovel and talking. And one of those times when Uncle Harry came back with the mattock, at the same time, Uncle Frank bent down with the shovel. And the mattock came down and chopped him right in the top of the head, and the blood spurted out, and he started screaming, "I'm killed, I'm killed, I'm killed." And his brother said, "You're not killed, or you couldn't holler like that." Well, they all went running toward the house. Now, imagine this. My poor grandmother is in there washing the dishes. She hears a big noise, looks out the back door. Here comes one of her boys with blood squirting out of his head, hollering, "I'm killed, I'm killed." Here comes another one with a shovel and another one with a mattock. Well, they all came running inside, and she looked at his head, and she took the dish rag and she washed it all out in cold water, and she held it on his head, and then she washed it out, and she held it on his head, and she kept, finally, it stopped bleeding. And then she looked at his head, and she said, "So that's what the bone looks like." He was chopped to the bone. Well, here's when the real problem started. They lived 16 miles from town on nothing but an old dirt farm road. Nobody had a vehicle of any kind. Nobody knew how to drive. They just had those workhorses. And even if they got to town, they didn't even know the name of a doctor. So as usual, my grandmother figured she had to take care of it. So she got a pot of water boiling on the stove, and she dropped something in that pot of water. And then she got out her straight razor. It was her straight razor because she was the one who always shaved my granddaddy with the straight razor. And she shaved the hair off all around where Uncle Frank's head was cut. And then she got the other boys to hold him down. And she fished in that pot of boiled water and fished out what she had dropped in, a big needle and thread. And while three brothers held him down, she sewed his head up. And then she said to my granddaddy, "I've never done this before. I don't know if I got it right. You better take him to town and find a doctor, because it might have to be done over again." And so my granddaddy got Uncle Frank on one of those workhorses. They rode all the way into town. It was after dark when they got there. One of the older brothers, the older ones, who was 15 years older, already lived in town. They went to Uncle Grover's house, spent the night, and the next morning he took them to meet the doctor. The doctor looked at Uncle Frank's head, checked it all out, and asked my granddaddy 3 questions. Did this boy's mother sew his head up? Yes. Did she boil the needle and thread first? I don't know how she knew to do that, but yes. And then the last question, does she make quilts? He said, yes, why? The doctor said, well, I would have put in about 6 stitches. I think she gave him 30. Little teeny tiny close-up stitches. The doctor said she did such a neat job, it might not even leave a scar when it heals. And then they got out a big brown glass jar that said iodine on the side of it. And they painted his head with iodine, and he started screaming, I'm killed, because it was just burning him up. All the alcohol in the iodine was. Well, finally they went back home. And then Uncle Frank looked in the mirror, and he started laughing. There his head had a big swarp shaved off of it by his mama. And then he had a stripe painted down right where she sewed him up. He thought, I'm so funny looking. They'll never make me go to church looking like this. Guess what? They did. And my daddy said there hadn't been that much laughter at church for 20 years. Well, when it was all over, my granddaddy got those boys together, and he said, now, boys, let's talk a little bit. You know, there ought to be some punishment. But you know what I always say? If you learn something, that's better than being punished. So here's the deal we'll make. If each one of you can tell me something you've learned through this, there won't be any punishment for anybody. He said, Moody, you're the oldest, so you go first. Did you learn anything? And Uncle Moody thought, and then he said, yes, we don't need a swimming hole. My granddaddy said, that's good. He said, Harry, did you learn anything? And Uncle Harry thought, and then he said, yes. If you ever need to get a whole bunch of blood out of anybody right quick, hit them right whack in the top of the head. And my granddaddy said, well, I never thought about it, but I guess that's right. I guess that'll do. He said, Frank, did you learn anything? And Uncle Frank said, I sure did. If 2 people are working, and one of them has a shovel, and one of them has a mattock, you better be the one that has the mattock. And then he said to my daddy, little Joe, did you learn anything? And my daddy said, I didn't need to. Because since Frank thought it up, I already knew it was a bad idea. But if I ever grow up and have children, I'm going to tell my children that their Uncle Frank is the best teacher they'll ever have. They need to ask him questions, watch what he does. Ask him questions, listen to what he says, and then don't dare do any of it. We have a little grandson who is 7 years old. No, he's just had a birthday. He's now 8 years old. His daddy is Kelly, and our grandson's name is Frank. Guess what he has to live up to? And he got that name because in Kelly's childhood, he remembers his great Uncle Frank as his favorite relative. The strange thing is, Kelly's great Uncle Frank died about 5 years before Kelly was born. But Kelly has heard so many stories that you just can't convince him that he doesn't really remember his Uncle Frank. And that's how powerful stories are, because they can keep people alive who are no longer walking around with us.
Thanks for joining us for a little story from the Appleseed.